Hello, Hughes History students with Mr. Howe, and you've done it. You've made it to your last YouTube video lesson of the school year, and you didn't even have to do a section assessment to go with this one, so I'm sure you're happy about that. But today's topic is going to be about the period of time after the Civil War called Reconstruction. So there are some required notes. And if you recall, last week I asked you to watch a crash course U.S. history video about Reconstruction. So if you're able to print out that answer sheet and write down your answers, and you want to write some notes on the back, or whether you want to get out a piece of lined paper, put your heading on it, and write your notes on a separate sheet of paper, that's fine. But let's talk about first, what does Reconstruction really mean in terms of U.S. history? So let's take a look. Since the Civil War that we've been studying for a while was fought between the years of 1861 and 1865, what had to be reconstructed after 1865? So get your paper out, get your notes ready, and on the back I'd like you to write down some notes about, well, what had to be reconstructed. So on the back of your video notes or on a separate sheet of paper, you can put your heading on it. What I'd like you to have as evidence that you watch this video are these notes and some notes that we're going to take after we go over the video notes as well. So there's two sections you have to have. This first section is about what exactly needed to be reconstructed during Reconstruction. You probably have an idea of what Reconstruction means in the terms of, like, building something, but in terms of U.S. history, what does it mean? Well, there's four basic things that I'd like you to understand that needed to be reconstructed during this time period called Reconstruction. The first one is going to be the lives of 4 million black Southerners, men, women, and children, who used to be slaves but are now free. So please write down the highlighted section. If you want to add the thinking questions, you can do that too. So when you think about that, you now have 4 million people who used to be slaves, had no rights, mostly no education, no land, but now they're free. The question is, how are they going to have opportunities to get their own land? Didn't have money, didn't have education. How are they going to get an education? What about jobs? So all these are part of the first part of Reconstruction is how are you going to reconstruct the lives of slaves and build them into being free people? What kind of assistance are they going to need? That needed to be figured out during this Reconstruction period. Number two, the lives of white Southerners who believed at some point they were no longer citizens of the United States. Most of the whites in the South looked themselves as citizens of the Confederate States. Now that the Confederate States is defeated, how can they become citizens again? How can you take these people that were, for the most part, traitors against the United States and move them into the category of being good citizens again of the United States? Number three, Reconstruction also had to do with the states that had seceded. How will those 11 states that seceded be joined with the northern states to form a national union again? What are going to be some of the things? Obviously, slavery is going to be gone. What else are they going to have to do to stop being regarded as traitorous states and become loyal states in the national union once again? And finally, the more traditional meaning of Reconstruction, probably the first one that you thought of, was about the physical damage to farms, towns, and cities throughout the South that had to be repaired. Who was going to pay to rebuild and repair all the physical damage that was done by the fighting? Very few battles took place in the North, but with all the battles that took place in the South, everything is going to be just one big mess that needs to be reconstructed for the good of everybody. Great time to pause and to write down these notes. I'll be looking for these when you send me your video notes, and to know that you were paying attention at least for this first part. There's more notes though, so make sure you keep on watching. So now that we know what we're talking about when we say Reconstruction, as far as what actually had to be reconstructed, now let's go back and take a look at the video notes that you were asked to fill out while you watched the crash course video number 22 about Reconstruction. So let's take a look at those notes and those answers to go with the notes that you have on the back. Instead of doing a section assessment or two about Reconstruction, and with the end of the year so close, I decided to have you watch a video from a series of videos that I really like. And when you watched it, you probably noticed the guy talks really fast. And so I hope that you felt free to pause it and go back to so that you could find the answers. But in the first part of the video, it talks about Andrew Johnson, who was the president after Lincoln, considered one of the worst presidents in United States history. According to the video, the question says, what were some problems of Andrew Johnson's plans to bring the former Confederate states back into, not onto, the Union? And the answer that I'd like you to get and write down, check your answers. He was a racist that didn't think blacks should play a role in Reconstruction, so obviously he didn't care too much about the newly freed slaves. He allowed the Confederate leaders to stay in power, and he allowed former Confederates to get their land back. So that's going to make him pretty unpopular among the Republicans in Congress and among a lot of Northerners who are going to look at this as just a step backwards from the fighting of the Civil War. The second question talks about sharecropping. And this is kind of a long answer, so hopefully you have some of these written down already. But the question is, how does the video describe sharecropping? Landowners replaced slavery with sharecropping. Landowners provided housing, tools, seeds, and the sharecroppers supplied the labor. Then they would, quote, share, end quote, the profits, with the owners getting from half to 3/4 of the profits and sharecroppers getting whatever was left. The video pointed out that it was not much different than slavery, and sharecroppers were still tied to the land that they did not own. That's kind of one of the conditions of slaves in the South as well. So sharecropping, and it's going to continue on for a long time, but that basically replaces the labor system in the South when it comes to agriculture. The third question from the video, according to the video, how did the radical Republicans change the course of Reconstruction in 1867? So think about that date for a second. The war ends in April of 1865. Lincoln is killed pretty much at the same time. And then for 2 years, you have a presidential Reconstruction with Andrew Johnson kind of taking the lead. Well, you can see that not much was changing as Andrew Johnson was leading Reconstruction. So the radical Republicans changed the course of Reconstruction in 1867. So here's a good answer. Here's 3 ideas I'd like you to write down and add to your notes if you don't already have these. So the first idea, radical Republicans in Congress were not happy that rights for blacks did not change after the Civil War and that former Confederates were back in power. They took over Reconstruction with the intent of protecting African American rights and punishing the former Confederates. And they passed Civil Rights Acts, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment to try to guarantee equal protection of the laws, citizenship, and voting rights for African Americans. So once again, as we normally do for our section assessments, this would be a great time to pause and to add some of these notes to your video notes so that when you take a picture, you can show me for the answers 1, 2, and 3. Let's take a look at the answers for questions 4 and 5. So for question 4, it talked about the Ku Klux Klan and where they came from and what their role was during Reconstruction. So it says, according to the video, how did terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan help white Southerners return to power? And a good answer, here's 3 ideas you can write down. White Southerners resented how the radical Republicans were using the U.S. Army to enforce political equality and equal rights. So the KKK was started to use violence to intimidate black Southerners and keep them from voting and demand equality. And then, of course, because people were scared to go vote because they might get a visit from the Ku Klux Klan, we have fewer black men voting. It allowed more white Democrats to take control of the South. So a great time to pause if you want to write down some ideas for question number 4. And on question number 5, it says, according to the video, in the election of 1876, what did the Republicans concede, that means give up, to allow their candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, to become president in 1876 that made Reconstruction a failure for African Americans. 1876, 1877 is considered the end of Reconstruction and the official return of power in the South to a lot of the white supremacists who were in charge, during the war and before the war. So this is where it really kind of becomes the failure of Reconstruction. So what did the Republicans do? I mean, what did they agree to in order to allow the white Southerners to be able to retake control? And the answer is Republicans agreed to give control of the South to the Democrats. Republicans agreed to pull all U.S. troops from the South, so no more protection for black Southerners. They had very little as it was, but at least there was somebody there that could harass the KKK, investigate crimes against blacks, but with no troops there, no help. And finally, Republicans agreed to build a transcontinental railroad to connect the South and the West to help the Southern economy. And this was all done because of the election controversy that allowed Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, to be elected to the presidency because there was a disputed election. So this is the beginning of this actually is the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of a long nightmare for African Americans across the country. So before we went over the video notes, there were some notes you had to answer that answers the question, what exactly needed to be reconstructed during Reconstruction? And here is the last section of notes that you have to add basically for the whole school year. So I guess this is the last thing you have to get all 10 points on this assignment. So the only thing you have to write down are the parts that are highlighted. So I'm going to go through everything, but once again, it'd be, stop in places, pause in places so that you can add the highlighted stuff that's on these notes that I'd like you to take. So the concluding question is, was Reconstruction successful? And we're going to focus on the black Southerners because the answer is mostly no. Although public education was established for all, black and white, and historically black colleges, still popular today, like Howard and Morehouse, become established, Reconstruction is a failure for black Southerners. By 1876, all the former Confederate states were under the control of white Southerners once again. Slave codes that were around before the Civil War were replaced by black codes, which restricted the basic civil rights of African Americans. Laws that segregated blacks and whites, known as Jim Crow laws, were passed in every state, and later the Supreme Court said in Plessy versus Ferguson, we did study that court case, that if states choose to segregate people by race, it does not violate the 14th Amendment. We know that 60 years later that's going to be reversed by the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but back in the 1800s, this is the federal government agreeing that, hey, if states want to have separate facilities for blacks and whites, that's up to the states. In other words, the idea of separate but equal becomes the law of the land. And even though public facilities were hardly ever equal, black Americans were going to be treated as second-class citizens, denied the right to vote, and terrorized, assaulted, and killed when they attempted to challenge white supremacy. Some historians argue that although the white Southerners lost the Civil War, they won the peace afterwards by being able to establish white supremacist governments all across the nation. Even though slavery ended in 1865, the beginning of the end of segregation doesn't begin until the 1950s, almost 90 years later, and a lot of people would say we're still fighting that battle right now. So the fight for equality for African Americans continues today. So make sure you pause here. Once again, you only have to write down the parts that are highlighted, and you'll be taking a picture of all of the notes that we've taken before. And now after the going over the vid notes, and you'll show me all of your notes to get full credit for this assignment. So we have to end our studies of U.S. history in your 8th grade year kind of on a downer, because Reconstruction was a failure. There were little sparks of hope. The colleges and universities that were started for Black Americans, which are still around. You did have a short period of time where the United States was more fair and more democratic than it ever had been in its history. The 14th Amendment, which is passed during this time period, is one of the most, if not the most important amendment ever added to the Constitution. But for the most part, Reconstruction was a failure, mostly for Black Americans, but in a way for the entire country. So, in a way, when we think about where we're at today with a lot of the protests and the unrest, the idea is that we're kind of continuing on with that struggle that started with Reconstruction to try to build a nation that really is a nation that reflects the idea of protecting everybody's life, protecting everybody's liberty, and protecting everybody's right to pursue their own happiness, and to live in a country where people are treated equally under the law, which is the promise of the 14th Amendment. So as we continue our studies, and I hope that you continue to learn more about 20th century and about how a lot of the struggles from Reconstruction are going to continue with the civil rights movement that begins in the late 40s and early 50s. I hope that you continue to understand that this is a very important time period in American history. And how things do begin to change, but not for 90 years after Reconstruction. Have a great summer. I'll miss you guys, and hopefully see you soon.